Hello, everybody. Magoti here, and I want to talk about something that I find personally very important. It's about world building, as you could probably tell from me showing you a map. A lot of people, especially when you're just starting out and your maps probably don't look all that great, will tell you that you should make your maps more realistic. They will tell you like just add realism, take inspiration from the real world, create realistic structures, create realistic. Just make your map look as realistic as possible, and your map will look good. And a lot of people have the same aspect about fantasy world building, like the world building in your world needs to be realistic, and from a certain point of view, that might make sense. If something is realistic, it keeps you grounded. And by realistic, I don't necessarily mean like exactly the same as the real world. However, it is somewhat implied in certain aspects, of course. Realistic just means that you could conceivably have it in the real world. Now, what do I mean by realism? Well, for example, Star Trek. Star Trek is very realistic. Okay, Star Trek is something that you could you could have something like that in I don't know a million years. Now, what isn't realistic in the same genre? That would be Star Wars. Star Wars isn't realistic. However, I would argue that making your maps, world building, and all of that more realistic doesn't necessarily make it better. In fact, it might actually even hurt in certain aspects. However, you do need to make your worlds, your maps, and your world building believable. And I think that's what a lot of people like subconsciously mean when they make it realistic. However, it can be very hard, like especially if you're just starting out, if you're a beginner, it could be very hard to differentiate between making something believable and making something realistic. Like, and I've fallen into this trap myself. Like, if you actually zoom on into this map, it has a very high definition. Okay, by all accounts, this map looks realistic. However, it's completely not believable. This has different topography, completely different. This island just has completely different topography. This is just like a flat with like banks, and this one is just like a broken fucking coast. And however, if I did this in a different style, if I didn't go reaching for that elusive realism, then you know I might have made something better. And I actually know that I could, because I've made this map, and this map does actually look pretty good. Okay, again, both of the maps are bare bones, right? But, no towns, nothing. But that's what I want to underline here. Okay, you could add towns, you could do that. That's a different thing. I'm just saying generally. Okay, I'm just speaking in more general terms. This map looks realistic, but it's completely unbelievable. However, this map doesn't look realistic. It uses a paper texture. Okay, like no satellite imagery would look like this. However, because it's in this style, it becomes far more believable. Now, there are a couple more examples I would like to do. Let's say that in your world you have some, let's just say crystals. Okay, you have crystals which greatly alter gravity. Okay, these crystals have like retarded amounts of power, and people can use those crystals to create super massive fucking structures, floating cities. uh, Thank you. Floating cities. You can create stars, maybe even if you have like miniature stars. If you have two power crystals, heat up plasma together. And where are those crystals being found? Like, probably underground. Those crystals probably have their power even when they're underground. So in that case, as a world builder, as a map maker, you shouldn't just try to make a blank realistic map. You shouldn't just use all of the uh, you know all of the knowledge you get from realistic worlds. You shouldn't have mountains created alongside ridgelines and stuff. I mean, you could. However, I would say it would take away. It would be less believable if your world, which has crystals, which can literally create floating cities, and crystals which can alter gravity to that extent, to look like a normal world, with normal ridgelines and stuff. Something like that, crystals like that can create weird mountainous structures. Land that is going in bridges, like mountains which are slanted at 30 degrees, and mountains which are just towers with weird chunks floating here and there. And that's what I want to say. The world needs to feel believable. It doesn't need to be realistic. Okay? And I want to, and you might think that I'm crazy and just blabbering on, but I want to bring two, and in my opinion, these are the two best examples I've seen in writing. Okay? Now, I'm first going to introduce a map which is completely unrealistic. Okay? This is a map which is floating in space. Okay? This is a floating island. The world. This is from Shadow of the Conqueror, Shedden Brooks. Great author. But yeah, this world isn't realistic. You will not be able to have a chunk of land in a world. However, the world is very believable because the author introduces two different types of stone, a light stone and like a dark stone, and the dark stone, if it doesn't have light applied to it, literally becomes an anchoring point in the world and nothing moves. Now, could you have made a regular world and just had that as a mineral? Of course. But I would say that wouldn't be realistic, because if you had a mineral that completely stops, you wouldn't get a normal world. Imagine all of the magma and all of the crust, all of the tectonic plates moving, and suddenly there's just a road stop. How does it interact? Just when the Earth spin, would those rocks just tear apart and just keep, because like if you're creating a stationary point in the universe, like a truly stationary point, that can have serious connotations. The world could actually be moving at like retardedly high speeds. Who knows? Compared to certain points, we're moving at the speed of light, even faster, in fact. So would the Blackstone just rip through it? And I think this underlies perfectly. If this was on a regular world, and like the author wanted to introduce certain types of song, certain magic, okay, which create a lot of interesting constructions and stuff, okay. But the world becomes believable because of it. Like the world is believable that if you had this on a regular world, it would not be believable, because you can't have a stationary point on a planet that rotates around the sun, which the sun rotates another around a black hole, and the universe might also rotate around something that's even heavier. Like, and that's the workaround. And on the opposite side, I want to talk about Blood Rose Rebellion. Now, this book is fine. However, this is the book that I want to say that should not be realistic. The map, the world building of this world should not be realistic. Before Charlemagne, effectively, in this world, you had people who randomly had magical powers and magical creatures wandering around. However, everything ended up the same. All of the same governments were formed, everything. That's completely unbelievable. If you had a world where magic existed and it progressed, the world, that's unbelievable. However, the world is realistic. I mean, it's the real world, so it kind of has to be. I mean, some other popular, but in my opinion, this is a very extreme case of this, because this is literally our history. Like this is literally like a historical novel with magic. So, and that breaks the world building, because yeah, it's realistic, but it's not believable. Like you're not gonna have the same things, the same events happen as in our world, but this world has magic. Even something as little as chopping down a tree or stepping on a butterfly could have a serious effect, which can completely change the course of history. Now, adding magical creatures and magical people to the world, I would say that it's a bit larger than stepping on a butterfly, but that might just be me. And some other examples I would say of worlds which aren't realistic but are believable is Harry Potter. I mean, yeah, it's not realistic, but it is believable. You can believe that that's how it works, and this is what I think is the most important. You should think about the fantasy aspects of your world because let's be honest, most of you are making a fantasy world, okay? Even if you're making a sci-fi world, you should think about the sci-fi and fantasy connotations of your world and apply them to world building and especially to maps. Because a good map can make or break a fantasy setting. Okay, if you have high fantasy with magical gods who can battle and scar the earth and stuff, your map needs to reflect that. Even though a large scar, a large sword wound in the earth made by a god is completely unrealistic, it makes the world that much more believable. If you have descriptions of massive creatures who roam the world, your world needs to reflect that. Your maps need to have indents in them that aren't created by water, that aren't created by erosion, that are created by these huge monstrous creatures. If you're and that's what I'm saying, like if you just make a realistic world, it will be boring. Because a fantasy world needs a world which is believable but not realistic.